As we move on to chapter 6, we run into several difficulties. What are we to make of this story? There are at least three important questions to ask. What does the word Nephilim in verse 4 mean? Who are these Nephilim? And who are the sons of God, and what did they do? So, what does the word Nephilim in verse 4 mean? It is sometimes translated giants, based on its translation in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. However, it's unclear what its meaning is, and perhaps this translation wasn't much more than a guess. For this reason, some translations simply retain the Hebrew word. But then, who are these Nephilim? And who are the mighty men mentioned in verse 4? Are they the children of the sons of God, or are they the Nephilim, or both? There's three terms or phrases used, and perhaps they're all referring to the same people. In that case, the Nephilim would be the children of the sons of God, as well as the mighty men of old. An interpretation that certainly makes sense, although we cannot be certain. In that case, the Nephilim would be outstanding and heroic, but perhaps also violent and domineering individuals, not unlike Nimrod in chapter 10. The most important question, of course, is who are the sons of God and what did they do? Several answers have been proposed. 1. The sons of God are fallen angels. This is how Jewish tradition understood the passage. In the book of Job, the phrase does indeed refer to angels. The book of Enoch, an apocalyptic work, interpreted Genesis 6 in this way, as did other Jewish writings from the time between the two testaments. Jude 6 alludes to the book of Enoch and may well refer to Genesis 6. The problem, though, is that angels do not marry and they cannot enter into sexual relationships with humans and have children. Fact is, sons of God sometimes is used differently, not for angels, but for kings or priests or even judges. 2. Sons of God is often taken to refer to the godly offspring of Adam and Eve, the line of Seth. So the godly people began to take ungodly, that is, Canaanite wives. But although God's people are sometimes considered his children or sons in the Old Testament, daughters of men by no means suggest something negative or more specific than women. And were all Cain's descendants bad and Seth's good? What about other descendants of Adam? 3. A third view is that the sons of God were human kings who claimed to be divine, or the son of a god, and who began to take a multitude of wives. That fits the time and what we know kings did in those days. 4. There were fallen angels, but fallen angels who had taken possession of certain persons, and these demon-possessed leaders or whatever had children. 5. The sons of God were the descendants of Adam who were mixing with pre-Adamites. Now, whatever the meaning, the point is clear. A new stage has been reached in the progress of evil. Here, something happened that should never have happened, and a boundary was crossed that should never have been crossed. The story is included to illustrate the increasing wickedness on earth, and as such prepares us for the flood. And so we come to the point halfway through Genesis 1 to 11, where God regrets his creation of humanity because of their corruption. As illustrated by the narrative of the sons of God marrying the daughters of man, we are hitting moral and spiritual bottom. This is the lowest point. Genesis 6 verse 5 states about man that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. What then follows is the counterpart to Genesis 1. God will undo his creation. The flood is an uncreation, showing several parallels to Genesis 1. Now, this uncreation will of course include humanity, animals, creeping things, and the birds of the heavens. But notice that in addition to this, the separations of day 2 and day 3 of creation are cancelled. No longer are the waters above separated from the waters below, and no longer is there land and sea. The earth returns to its unformed beginning, to the tohu vabohu of Genesis 1 verse 2. In the second half of the flood narrative, chapter 8 and 9, we read about recreation. And again there are several parallels to Genesis 1. The dry land reappears. Animals and humans get a second chance. God promises not to do this again, but instead to maintain order. Genesis 8 verse 22, while the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Separations and functions will be upheld, the order of creation is guaranteed. Humanity is once again blessed by God and told to multiply and fill the earth. Foods are assigned, as in Genesis 1 verse 29 and 30, and God's image in humans is upheld. This means that God will not give up on creation or on humanity. Although the text does not say anything about what he will do instead, we are left wondering, where is this story going? At this point, it's interesting to make a short comparison with the Gilgamesh epic. If you've read the handout, you probably realize that this seems to be a different version of the same story. Especially the reference to the birds cannot be a mere coincidence. At the same time, there is a striking difference. The Gilgamesh epic does not give a clear reason for the flood. In other flood narratives of the ancient world, the flood comes because people make too much noise and the gods want their peace. Some gods. I suspect that the purpose of Genesis once again is polemical. It seeks to correct the version that everybody knew, not in the details, but in two foundational facts. First, there is only one God involved. And second, this one God has a very good reason to bring the flood. It is not because he grew tired of humans or couldn't sleep because of them. Okay, so far the theology of the flood narrative. I will make another short detour to attempt a more synthetic or holistic interpretation, because from this perspective, in this other approach or reading, there is an important discussion about the flood. Was it local or was it global? At first sight, the text certainly sounds absolute and universal. So why even doubt a global flood? Well, once one starts thinking about it, it becomes hard to imagine. There is no evidence for a universal flood in the recent past. Nothing suggests that life on Earth suffered such a total disruption. On the contrary, it appears that there is a clear continuity in many places for a very long time. It is unclear where the enormous amount of water needed to cover the highest mountains would have come from, or where it went after the flood. Of course, God could create and uncreate this water, but this is not what the text says. At stake here is not what God could or couldn't do, but what he actually did. To fit all the animals on the ark is the smaller problem. What about the very specialized nutritional needs of many species? What about the plants? How did they survive a year-long submersion in saline water? Not to mention the crushing water pressure of 8,000 meters of water. What about soil microorganisms, insects, sweet water animals? How did species from remote isolated islands make it to the ark and back? For this reason, many interpreters opt for a local or regional flood and consider the language of Genesis 6 to 9 as hyperbole, comparable, for instance, to Genesis 41 verse 57, where a famine came upon the whole earth, and the whole earth came to Egypt to buy grain. Well, presumably the Americans did not come. One interesting suggestion, although it is really just a guess, is that the original event may have been the filling of the basin we call the Black Sea. It used to be land. It's only around 5,500 BC that the rising sea level enabled the Mediterranean to break through the Bosporus and flood the entire basin. Needless to say, this would have been a momentous disaster for the people living there. But of course, we cannot be sure that this is the historical setting of Noah's story. It just shows that there have been huge catastrophes in the history of humanity that may have led to such a narrative. Whatever the exact historical circumstances of the flood, the point of the flood narrative is clear. It shows the depravity, the wickedness of humans. Man left to himself is a hopeless case. Judgment is inevitable and just. The flood narrative is the climax in the account of man's fall and corruption. God has every right, and perhaps every reason, to judge and even destroy humankind. That he does not do so is due to his grace and his sovereign decision, not to inability or to indifference to evil. God's grace. That is the second point of the story. He is not going to give up on humanity. In addition, remember that Genesis is theology told as story. Genesis 1 through 11 contains much which more or less everyone knew or believed, but corrected theistically and monotheistically. Clear is, this disaster was not due to the whims or moods of some gods, as other flood narratives have it. The flood narrative should thus instill us with the fear of God. Humanity should watch its ways, because God is watching. Noah's drunkenness and the behavior of his son Ham function as another small fall followed by a curse, not unlike the fall of Cain in chapter 4. It shows that things are not off to a good start. Things have not improved because of the flood. Since this passage has often been misused and misinterpreted in a particular way, I need to say a little more. It has often been used to justify the subordination and enslavement of black Africans. After all, they are the descendants of Ham, who was cursed by Noah to be a servant of servants to his brothers. Genesis 9 verse 25. But in this way, Scripture, the very words that should be vehicles of grace and of salvation, are turned into instruments of oppression and exploitation. Let's put this interpretation to the text. 1. Even if there would be such a curse, the work of Christ should have put an end to it. He became a curse for us to redeem us from the curse. 2. But in fact there is no such curse, since the curse specifically applies to Canaan, not Ham. The text does not explain why this one son of Ham was cursed instead of his father or his brothers, but it does have a function in the book of Genesis. This explains why the Canaanites developed into a particularly immoral and depraved group to be replaced by the Israelites. But the Canaanites are only one branch of Ham's descendants, the ones who settled in Canaan, not Africa. And 3, who says that black Africans descend from Ham? Genesis 10 goes no further than Egypt, Cush and Put, nations in the utter northeast of Africa. Black Africans are not listed in this chapter. Like Asians and Native Americans, they were simply not known to the ancient Israelites. Nothing suggests that black Africans are the descendants of the Egyptians. This is a racist abuse of scripture that destroys the very unity and dignity of the human race that Genesis seeks to establish. Let's move on to chapter 10. It gives us the descendants of Noah, most of whom are either nations or individuals who were considered founding fathers or ancestors of a nation. And one crucial thing to realize is the incompleteness of this overview. It is limited to those nations Israel knew about. It is limited to their world, which was rather small by our standards. Only a small part of Asia, Africa and Europe are included. Australia, America and many oceanic islands are completely missing. Nevertheless, this overview matches the best science of today. It maps the peoples of the known world and their relationship to each other before zooming in on Abraham's line. As such, once again, it leaves us wondering. This is an open end. What about all these nations? What about them? Well, God will get back to them, but not for a very long time. As we move on, we come to the sad anticlimax of Genesis and the story of creation. We read about yet another fall, this time a cultural and collective one. It's a story we have underestimated. We make it a story for children, or a source of jokes. If it hadn't been for the Tower of Babel, I wouldn't have had to learn English. We would all be speaking Dutch. But Genesis 11 is a theological statement of great magnitude. It is not about language or about towers. It is about humankind. What Adam and Eve did on an individual level, humanity now does collectively. Humankind declares its independence from God. Babel is the ultimate rebellion. This is the end point. From now on, there is going to be no more progress. Humanity is stuck forever in rebellion against God, separated from God. This is where Genesis ends, where the Bible ends, unless God has an idea how to fix this. From here on, Babel will have an evil sound in Scripture. It will become a symbol for the world. Babylon then stands for human civilization in opposition against God, the biblical counterpart to Jerusalem. The second half of chapter 11 adds the genealogy that connects Shem with Abraham, here too with 10 generations listed. With this, we come to the great turning point of Genesis, which also is the great turning point in salvation history. At this point, we begin to learn in what way God intends to redeem humanity and creation, and how the original cryptic promise of Genesis 3 verse 15, the seed of woman will crush the serpent's head, is to be fulfilled. Chapter 11 ends the bad news. We are now ready to hear and appreciate the good news.